Hello dear colleagues, my name is Dmitry and I work for the Dmytry Nikitin School, and today with me is Andrew Walkley, and you may know Andrew Walkley as the co-founder of Lexical Lab, which is a language school in London. Andrew is also the author of Outcomes 2nd edition, Perspective, and Teaching Lexically, which is a book for teachers. And what's the title of your latest book? Roadmap. And his latest book, written in co-author with Hugh Deller, is Roadmap. So today we are in Krasnoyarsk, Siberia, Russia, and we are running workshops for the local teachers. And Andrew kindly agreed to be interviewed. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. To be here.
Because your latest book is about teaching beginners, it's Outcomes beginners.
Yeah.
My first question, what is actually the difference between beginner and elementary levels?
It's an interesting question. I actually often, when I was, we originally had Outcomes Elementary for a long time, and before that also Innovations Elementary. And people often used to say, oh, it's a bit too difficult. Mm-hmm. And that's because I always thought it's elementary and not beginner. So if you're an A1 student, which is what you should be when you start elementary, then if you look in the CFR or something like that, it says basically you can say certain things in very basic ways, talk about yourself in very basic ways, use words for single words or short phrases to communicate, even though you're not very accurate. So in other words, you do have a certain basis in English language when you're elementary. And so for me, I would imagine you'd studied present simple, verb to be, past simple, etc. So do we really need to start from zero again at elementary?
That's true, but you are kind of starting from zero at elementary level anyway, right?
What, with outcomes?
Generally.
No.
It's with recycling.
Yeah, but you could, for example, I wouldn't have a problem. I mean, I think if you looked at Innovations Elementary compared to Outcomes is a bit more traditional. Mm-hmm. So like in Innovation Elementary, I think in the first unit, the students see the word was, for example. Mm-hmm. I think I was born. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for me that's not a problem because I know that the students will have seen it. I don't expect them to be able to say it or necessarily be able to produce it or understand, they've been exposed to it. So what would happen is the students would just see it, they would understand more or less, and they move on. So for me, the elementary shouldn't, yes, in terms of developing, we're going to still be working with very basic grammar, etc. But the students could be seeing things they've seen already at beginner from the first unit.
And Andrew, what about the fundamental principles which are behind teaching beginner students? Do you have some principles for teaching beginners which are different from teaching the rest of the students?
A couple. I mean, obviously, I think beginners, in a way, many of the same issues that affect other classes are basically, they're essentially the same. They're still there in beginner, but in beginner they become more extreme. So, for example, if you take differential levels, so in beginner classes, you will typically have a mixture of levels. It's just that some of the beginners will absolutely have nothing or almost nothing. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult for them to partake at all in the class, where you've got some students, as we know, who will maybe be almost elementary. They've experienced language, maybe they've learnt at school, so they have some distant knowledge of grammar and some words which they just can't put into use. And so the difference is they could maybe follow quite a bit in the class, whereas these people with nothing can almost follow nothing. the same would be true at a higher level. You have a mixture of levels in intermediate, but usually we don't notice that so much because basically they can all function to some degree in those in the intermediate level. So, returning to your question, the difference for me is firstly I would have a bit more. The main difference, I think, would be I'd have a bit more teacher-to-student interaction at beginner, because the students can't basically do pair work. They can do pair work, but in a very limited way. So that it would last for maybe 30 seconds, and we still have to do that pair work because to ensure that all the students get enough opportunity to practice. But we have to accept that it will be very limited. So what we can do then is to kind of repeat some of that pair work as one-to-one. And through that you can also extend a little bit what they are able to say. You can ask follow-up questions where you can help them with the answers and these kinds of things.
And you call it dialogue building technique?
Yeah, so yes.
Approach?
Yeah, I mean, I would, with dialogue building, I mean, I do use more of that dialogue building at lower levels. So, which is basically I present a first question, such as where are you from, and then get the answers from different students, and then I kind of respond in the next level, you know, so where are you from? Russia, and I might then say what part. Okay, and then we get the second part, and then maybe have you been there, or is it nice, whichever you want to choose as the next line. You can build up the conversation with the students in that way.
And this extra phrase, they are written down somewhere on the board, right?
Yeah, so you elicit it, you repeat it. So often I'll be repeating it first orally, and then at some point I would write it on the board and use that to remind the students.
While dialogue building at the beginner level, can you come up working with students' language with some high level vocabulary they want to say?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think.
What would you do with that?
I would tell them it.
You would tell them?
Yeah. So I think my feeling is if the students are trying to say it, then give it to them. And if it enables them then to continue the conversation. What I might not do is, if it's particularly high level or unusual, I think that's unlikely at beginner actually. Most of the things they will try and say are fairly basic actually. But if they did, I might tell that student how to say it in English, maybe with translation if I could do it. And I wouldn't write that word on the board for the other students. Whereas if I'm using like teachers to students, the student says, for example, I want to say, can I go to the toilet, for example. I might write that on the board for all students, because that is going to be useful for all students. And then I might even drill it and practice it for everybody.
Well, I had a very basic conversation, do you have a pet? And the answer was, yes, I have a pet, I have a cat. And the student wanted to say, I adopted her, it was a stray cat and I adopted her a year ago.
Right.
It's quite a high level vocabulary, and it's this kind of vocabulary, well,
yes.
it may not be relevant to all the group.
Exactly, so I definitely wouldn't be writing stray cat on the thing or adopt. I would probably, I might even reinterpret what the student wants to say in a slightly simpler way. So I might put, I found a cat on the street.
Yeah. Good.
And, I found her on the street. I have a cat, I found her on the street. That might be the way I would present it to the rest of the class.
And you mentioned working with mixed abilities classes. What are your top tips for working with mixed abilities classes? Because some teachers are terrified working with mixed abilities groups, even if they have like A2 and A2 slightly plus, they're going to complain how terrible their life is. Can you share some advice on how to deal with mixed abilities groups?
So I think the main thing is it's really to make sure you're working with the students and listening to what they're trying to say and responding to what they're trying to say. So this in essence kind of will match their level. So if, for example, you have this conversation, have you been to London before? And the answer is yes, I went there last year, for example. Maybe a higher level student will try and say something more sophisticated. So yeah, I was there on business a few years ago. Whereas the lowest level person will just want to say yes. So on one level you can just provide the yes answer to the weaker student, but the higher level student, we can give them something slightly beyond what the level of some of the other students. We can respond to what they're trying to say, and in providing that language they're increasing their level, so you're managing them in that way.
Doesn't it mean that actually for mixed groups, if you have, let's say, elementary and pre-intermediate or elementary and intermediate students in one group, and it happens in some context, I've been teaching for university physical education department, I've been teaching English. I had students from absolutely zero to upper intermediate in one group. You just have to teach them, and does it mean that it's better not to work with any student's book, but just to teach kind of unplugged, combined materials, because you can't really force students to buy an intermediate book if some of them are beginners and some are upper intermediate?
Yes.
But you are able to create your own materials tailored for the group.
So I think there's two. I mean, I found actually for the weaker students sometimes it is helpful to have the book. So because at least, for example, they can go home, they can study it on their own, they can look up words they don't know, they can look back on what you've done in the class. So to me, there's a value in having the book, having seeing where they're going, seeing where they've come from. And in a way, the weaker students, so beginner, I think it's helpful to have things on the page. So on one level, they can just simply read out. What you need is the book has to be things which they might actually want to say. So it has to be linked to something valuable in and of itself. But at the same time, what we need to be doing is constantly looking for opportunities for the students to go beyond or around this language. So it's giving them those opportunities to talk about themselves, to practice, where their language will, the level of the discourse will go to the level of the student in essence. So imagine you're doing something on feelings. We can teach some words to connect you with feelings. Say they're intermediate, you've got some students who are quite close to beginner. Those students will basically remember 3 feelings. They'll be tired, bored, happy, for example. The other students will try and remember all the other ones. The natural practice is then, well, tell me about a time when you were one of these feelings. And at that moment, again, the elementary students will say as much as they can about when they were happy or sad. It will take a shorter time. So there may be a moment where they, there is, you will have to accept that there might be some people who will be a moment where they're doing less than the better students. But the better students can basically say things quicker. They'll spend a shorter amount of time to say the amount that they're trying to say. So it tends to equalise, I think.
My only question: how you assure that weaker students are going to remember basic vocabulary, but not higher level vocabulary? They may remember 3 words from higher level, they don't remember basic vocabulary. But let's just keep it.
I mean, the reality is, it's helpful. It's not always ideal.
It's not. Life is
not
Disneyland.
Sometimes, some people will lose out. The lower tend to be the lowest level ones will lose out.
Talking about mixed levels, my last question is, do you think it's generally beneficial for students to work in mixed level groups because you have all the diversity or would you rather prefer to have, and I'm not talking about these extreme ends when you have proficiency students and elementary students, but I'm talking about pre-intermediate and intermediate students learning English together in the same group, or do you think that we should have these very thorough placement tests and then watch the students learning and then create kind of very close groups in terms of level, like A1, A1.2, A1.3,
I think
or
this
just
is,
A1 without adding any kind of close to A2 students?
Yeah. I think this is impossible myself. We can devise a test which we think is reduced in this way, but the problem with what will happen is that firstly, how do you decide what's in the test which differentiates A1 with A1 plus? One inevitably will be a grammar rule. So these grammars, and we're kind of then encouraging this kind of building block idea of grammar, which it doesn't work like that as far as I'm concerned. That in a way that, as I mentioned before, we could see the fact you can't produce that kind of grammar or don't fully understand it doesn't mean say you know nothing about it. That being able to see it in a text, you look confused, or being able to kind of so for example, if we take the example of was in the first unit of an elementary, the student quite a few students will know what it is, they'll understand it. You could give for those who don't, you could give a very brief translation or explanation. It's the past of am, for example. That doesn't mean the students have mastered that grammar in any way. So if you do a test on was, quite probably a lot of those students would fail it. But it still doesn't mean that you shouldn't have it in that.
They may recognize it, but
you can still have it within the A1 band, if you like. And then when you come to A1 plus, I don't know, it's becoming a kind of trying to differentiate with grammar. I don't think it quite works in that way. And then in terms of vocabulary, at any level you can only test a tiny proportion of the amount of vocabulary that is required or typical at that level. So say you imagine there's 6,000 words up to is typical for up to an intermediate student. That means elementary, well, there are 500 words or 1,000 words, 1,500 words. Well, you're only going to test in a test at most 20, 30.
It's the topic of an absolutely different longer interview.
Yeah.
We have this question
So it's
vocabulary levels.
It's very difficult to differentiate in that way. And just as the final thing, I suppose, there is evidence. I don't know if you come across John Hattie with the visible learning.
Sure.
One of the things which he suggests was most successful in general education. This is peer teaching. And so this kind of interaction with students of different levels, there is some suggestion that's a supportive thing and helps students.
My point is that normally they would like to put a weaker student and a stronger student together, but I think that kind of weaker students can teach stronger students quite a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I think especially when it comes to vocabulary, because the vocabulary is kind of acquired in a fairly random way.
And unit revision, unit test, because at the end of the unit you test words which you taught during the unit.
Yeah.
Okay. We can carry on talking for ages, but we're not going to. Don't worry, because we have now people queuing for the next session, and you need some time for your afternoon nap. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for watching. And hope to see you one day in our live event with the Dmytro Nikitin School. And I do recommend Lexical Lab as an amazing place in London to boost your English and to work with your methodology, to have an ELT training. And Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dmitry.
Have a very good day.
Hope
Bye.
to see you sometime soon. All right, bye.